Everybody, I think we shall start, and I presume. Well, I saw the message saying the webinar is being recorded, and we'll make sure that's posted as soon as possible on the ICOMOS channel, and I guess shared with everybody so they can host it on their own channels too, and to try and get the best and widest coverage for this really important topic. Anyway, I think we can start, and I'd like to welcome everybody, the panelists and all the guests and the participants that are involved in this webinar. The suggestion by Hans to hold it and be hosted by ICOMOS is very much appreciated. It sort of continues the webinar with a little break, but continues the webinar chain that we had throughout the entire 2021. And I think this is an extremely great topic. Not necessarily to finish the webinar series, because we expect that there'll be other special ones in the future, but I think never has there been a better time to start to discuss this in terms of how we integrate climate change into our discipline. And I think we're privileged today to have Hans and the team from the US who are going to give their perspective on this particular topic. And it's a pleasure for me to introduce the panelists. I'd like to start off with Madeline. Madeline Roth is a maritime archaeologist with the NOAA Office of National Marine Sanctuaries Maritime Heritage Program. Her work primarily focuses on heritage management and monitoring. Second is Stephanie Gangula, I hope I pronounced that okay, is a maritime archaeologist and the resource protection coordinator at NOAA's Thunder Bay National Marine Sanctuary. She is also a trainer with the National Network for Ocean and Climate Change Interpretation, and encourages public discourse to be positive, civic-minded and solutions-focused. Next is Amanda Evans, who has over 20 years experience in underwater archaeology, with specializations in marine geophysics and the study of submerged paleolandscapes. She currently serves as the maritime practitioner leader for Gray and Pape, a heritage consultancy firm in the United States. Susan Langley has been the director of Maryland Maritime Archaeology Program for more than 28 years and serves as both the state underwater archaeologist and dive safety officer. She teaches at several public and private colleges and universities, including courses in Thailand for the Southeast Asia Ministers of Education organization. Next is Melanie Damore. Melanie is a marine archaeologist and the environmental studies coordinator for the US Bureau of Ocean Energy Management, otherwise known as BOEM to many of us, Gulf of Mexico Region Office. Over a nearly 25-year career, Melanie has investigated submerged pre-contact and historic shipwreck sites throughout the southeastern US, as well as in Guatemala, Panama, and Mexico. Her research primarily focuses on impacts to shipwrecks from oil spills and subsea mudslides, as well as shipwreck ecology and their role as habitat for microbial communities. And last but not least is Hans van Tilburg. Hans is a maritime archaeologist and historian for NOAA's Office of National Marine Sanctuaries and a member of the ICUCH Bureau. He focuses on the Pacific Island region and the UCH resource in the Asia Pacific. Welcome to you all, and over to you, Hans.
Thank you, Chris. Let me share screen and have a brief explanation of how this will go about. And I believe the title slide should be up, yes?
Yes, looking good, Hans.
Okay, good, thanks. Thank you everyone for joining. It's been very interesting to pull this together. I agree with Chris's earlier informal comment. This is a broad and challenging topic, but a very important one. And so today we have coordinated and gathered this panel together to discuss the topic, broadly focusing on, organized in 6 climate impact questions to kind of focus our discussion. Otherwise, it will be kind of a group discussion as we move through those questions. We will have some links that we'll try to put in the chat column as we go along and comments to make. And then hopefully plenty of time at the end to have a discussion with you, an interactive back and forth about what we face and what our challenges and next steps are. So to begin, Maddie, do you want to say something about the scope of the question, the heritage resource that we're addressing?
Sure, thanks, Hans. So hello, everybody. Thank you so much for joining. This panel was actually, it's a little bit of an extension from a now delayed upcoming panel at the Society for Historical Archaeology Conference. It was scheduled for this past December and has now been delayed until our next meeting. Apologies, this past January. And this upcoming meeting of January 2023 will hopefully have the original panel. But in the meantime, we're still meeting as a group to discuss a very important topic to all of us, which is thinking about climate change and its impacts to heritage and heritage management, underwater cultural heritage resources. And so when we talk about those impacts, it's really the impacts to physical resources, to tangible heritage, as well as impacts to intangible heritage resources, the practices, beliefs, cultural expressions, traditions, and intergenerational knowledge that exists within maritime places and spaces.
Yeah, it's very broad, varied, challenging. But it's where the discussion is headed. We'll have approximately 5 to 6 minutes for each of these questions as we go through, and we're not absolutely fixed to those times, but I might be a bit of a time wrangler, a clock watcher for this one, and otherwise, the panel will address a number of different issues. And to begin with, the first question will be, what are the direct impacts to heritage resources? What are we seeing now? What do we predict will happen? So take it away, panel.
Well, I'll jump on it. This is Susan.
Okay.
We're studying a lot right now on ocean acidification, worrying about how it can possibly be impacting our metal hull wrecks, but even those wooden wrecks with metal fasteners. And this, we're looking at trying to get traction with some of the local agencies who don't really see the heritage aspect by pointing out that these are also artificial reefs. And this is going to have an economic impact in your recreational commercial fishing. If they go away, if they collapse in, you may lose tourism dollars from people who are interested in diving or spearfishing, shellfish collecting when they grow on these wrecks. So we're looking at that. We're dealing with largely the Chesapeake Bay, although we do have an ocean component as well, but it's very shallow. And of course, we're seeing huge increases in the water temperature, which I think we'll talk about more down the road here. But with those temperature changes, we're very concerned about the expansion of wood-devouring mollusks, at least in their larval state, like Teredo nivalis or Bankia gouldii, Limnoria. I have a lot of wooden wrecks that are not completely submerged. And we're now seeing that these creatures are becoming also more freshwater tolerant, more cold water tolerant. So their spread is going to have a huge impact for us as well. And there's more, but I'm going to pass off to my colleagues.
Mm-hmm.
Thanks, Susan. I was going to jump in and just talk about the changing water conditions, whether it's rising sea levels, inundation of currently terrestrial sites, changing conditions for submerged sites due to increased storm frequency or severity. All of those things are changing the environments in which these resources are found. And especially when we talk about sea level rise, there are intangible spaces, sacred spaces on land that are being threatened with submergence and the loss of connection to those landscapes.
And I'd like to continue, sorry, Hans. I'd just like to continue that discussion in terms of storm effects. Working in the Gulf of Mexico for pretty much the entirety of my career, one thing that we are well known for is our hurricane season. And if you haven't spent your summer in the cone of death, you haven't really lived. So one of the things that we're seeing, sorry, It's afternoon for me. I'm just getting my groove on now. One of the things that we've actually seen, interestingly, from storms is a lot of very interesting things that are happening with some of the shipwrecks. And as you can see on this particular slide here, on some of the more recent artificial reefs, storms have actually had pretty substantial impacts, not just in terms of damage, but actually moving some of these vessels. The one in the middle, for example, the entire shipwreck was shifted quite a distance across the seafloor. And then the third example there, Spiegel Grove, was sunk as an artificial reef off of Florida, and it landed on its starboard side. And then a hurricane came along and righted the shipwreck. So these storms are actually pretty powerful and can do a lot of damage. And shifting back to the Gulf of Mexico, for example, my agency funded a study back in 2007 that looked at hurricane impacts to shipwrecks after our active 2005 season with hurricanes Katrina and Rita off the coast of Louisiana and Texas. And one of the interesting things that our study contractor found was that some of the sites, even as much as 25 to 30 nautical miles away from the actual hurricane track and on the weaker side of the storm, were experiencing forces in the water equivalent to an EF3 tornado on land. EF is the enhanced Fujita scale. And essentially what that means is wind speeds of 3-second wind gusts between 136 to 165 miles per hour. And this is what shipwrecks were experiencing in the water in terms of the shift back and forth of the storm surge. So they can actually be quite destructive. But one of the interesting things that this study found was that a lot of this damage appears to happen early in the shipwreck's life after it reaches the seafloor, and that over time it starts to stabilize and that degradation kind of dies down a little bit. But another finding from that study was that buried sites actually stayed pretty well intact and weren't as badly affected. But one thing that we need to consider with climate change is that, if the frequency and strength of these storms increases, we may see that damage increasing again, and that shift out of an equilibrium back towards more dynamic degradation processes. So just something to consider.
Right. A quick note. Sorry to interject. I don't think I'm able to put links into the chat column while I'm presenting the PowerPoint. So if one of you could assist from the notes page, that would be fantastic. And Melanie, I know that there's a BOEM study from 2011 on hurricane impacts on historic shipwrecks in the Gulf of Mexico, and that's a great link to add to the column if we can. And at the end of this presentation, within the presentation itself, we'll have a links page at the end, which will be recorded on the YouTube channel, which will provide those links to these references as well. I want to say that I did have a chance to do some survey and work with some NOAA colleagues up in the Arctic, and another impact would be to the heritage properties located along the shore, the historic whaling wrecks, which were lost to the ice back in the 19th century. And with the lack of shore ice, with the warming of the climate, then the coast is exposed to much more erosion, which not only impacts those historic whaling shipwrecks, but has forced villages to move back from the shore. And in this image, you can see the protective berm that's being built in front of Barrow, just to protect the houses from the climate change impacts. An example that's come up recently a couple times, and we've discussed, various types of UCH. This is living heritage and underwater cultural heritage, these intertidal fish weirs in Asia and in the Pacific. And this has been an important topic in the Asia Pacific Conference recently by a number of ICUCH members and others. The impacts in this intertidal zone to increased storm surge and changing sea levels, of course, as well as the warming temperature of the water. And it's just a note on loss of intangible cultural heritage, on the knowledge and skills and cultural fishing practices, cultural practices that are important to many people. So it's not just the physical resource as well. But you're right, ocean acidification, increased storm activity, increased temperatures, changes to these ocean parameters have been mentioned in a number of articles as critical direct impacts affecting UCH and the intangible maritime heritage. Anything else from the panel on the direct impacts before we move on to the indirect?
Yes,
Susan,
impacts? Yes.
This is Stephanie here in the Great Lakes and in the heart of our inland oceans here. And there definitely are hints of the very same issues that are facing our ocean, the acidification, changing levels, and invasive species, and related in different ways that I can get into more later. But just talking about lake levels specifically, they are, there's many factors that affect the fluctuation in lake levels, and so it makes it difficult to predict. But fluctuations are, due to our warming climate, definitely expected to become more intense with higher highs and lower lows, and even less time between those extremes. And that one big example is affecting our shallow, very shallow shipwrecks, which we have many, or even our beached shipwrecks here in the Great Lakes.
Right, and isn't there an impact on the bio layer of the mussels that have covered the wrecks, and the change in climate is affecting the status of that for better or for worse, or both,
Yes,
on those wooden shipwrecks?
For sure, Hans, and thank you for bringing that up. Invasive species may not be a direct result of climate change, but climate impacts, such as the warming waters, can lead to invasion of new areas, or give those species advantage over native species. And so if you have this Cladophora, for example, which isn't invasive, but it does thrive in warming waters and can definitely coat the shipwrecks, obliterating archaeological features. Just one example.
Mm-hmm.
Susan, I would add one of the unusual things that we hadn't anticipated is that my terrestrial colleagues are reporting are that low-lying sites that don't appear, they're not in a marsh, they're just low-lying. The groundwater is becoming acidic and destroying artifacts before they're even excavated. They're excavating sites that are being impacted by ocean acidification that they thought were completely undisturbed, at least undisturbed by people. But we hadn't thought about the groundwater rising up from beneath and impacting sites.
All right. Interesting. Perhaps we can discuss a bit about these indirect impacts. And Susan, you brought up something really interesting about the Chesapeake Bay.
Yeah, it's actually, and this is one of the reasons, but we've actually changed how we're doing archaeology now by changing our scheduling because of the presence of Vibrio vulnificus. If you're not familiar with it, that is the flesh eater. It's bacteria, and it lives in the bottom sediments, but people have died from being out fishing and being gouged with a catfish barbule. So it's if you don't get treated very quickly, you will lose a limb, and within 4 days you'll probably die. You can get it from ingesting shellfish. That's a different kettle of fish. When you look at numbers, they look very high, but I'm only talking about through abrasions. I had a colleague catch it, and he was fully suited with gloves. Now, so we are very concerned about it. It loves warm, shallow water, and as a beekeeper, I've been loving seeing spring come earlier and seeing our summers last longer and stay hotter. But if you look at this chart, you can see how they're predicting the Chesapeake is getting hotter and hotter. So there are areas we will not dive in the summer. We'll use remote sensing in those areas if we have to work there. We'll figure out our targets, and we'll go back in the fall, winter, spring. In the summer, if we're going to dive, we'll limit that to you can see the blue areas, the upper echelon of the bay, mouths of rivers, deeper water, and the mouth of the bay itself. But so now the presence of Vibrio, which I don't believe it was an invasive, it's always been there, but its proliferation is actually affecting now how we do archaeology when we do it. And I don't know if that's impacting other people, but I'd be interested in knowing if it is.
I've dived in on some sites in Florida, and I remember that summer years ago, there were a number of issues related to fish kills, which we were worried about in terms of our own health. And so this simply exacerbates that problem, I must say. But if these indirect impacts are affecting our research access to do what we do, to study these UCH sites It's got to also be affecting, the public's access to UCH and heritage tourism. And if you affect access in that way, it's changing the value of these sites underwater, ultimately, I would suppose. But there are other indirect impacts as well. And we mentioned displacement of the wreck directly from storm and hurricanes, but there's an indirect effect as well.
So I can take this one. This slide is actually covering a project that's near and dear to my heart. I've been working with the U.S. Geological Survey since 2016 off the coast of Louisiana, an area called the Mississippi River Delta Front. And that particular area is prone to subsea mudslide events. And what we found from previous studies that they're not just triggered by major storm events like hurricanes or even earthquakes, but the annual winter storms that come through the Gulf can trigger a mudslide. So what you're seeing here is a multi-beam sonar image of a 500-foot-long steel-hulled oil tanker named Virginia, which was torpedoed by a German U-boat in 1942 off the southwest pass of the Mississippi River. That particular shipwreck has been moving over the years. We believe it sank about 11 kilometers north of where it's currently located. So we've been collecting data, geophysical data over time and tracking the movement of this shipwreck. And why that's a problem for us, BOEM is a regulatory agency and we manage offshore oil and gas, as well as renewable energy and marine minerals. And in this particular case, what you're seeing on the lower right is the shipwreck in the middle with its 2004 location indicated. In that 1,000-foot circle around it, that is an avoidance zone that we place around the shipwreck so that industry doesn't perform any seafloor disturbing activities there. They don't install a pipeline, they don't place an anchor or a well or anything. But unfortunately, due to a lot of these storms, the shipwreck is now located well outside of its avoidance zone. And you see on the bottom where we found it in 2017. So this poor shipwreck has been moving over time and it's trended to the southeast for a while and then to the southwest other times. So this is a problem for us if an operator wants to install a pipeline downslope of this particular shipwreck, we kind of need to know where it is. So yeah, and this isn't the only one. We actually have several dozen shipwrecks off the coast here that we think may be moving similarly. So this is a management problem for us from both sides, not just for protecting UCH, but for risk management for oil and gas operations. So we're in the process of putting together a multidisciplinary study with several other federal agencies to use these shipwrecks as essentially seafloor sentinels for monitoring mudslide events. So this is going to be a big thing for us. But I mean, if we're seeing more frequent storms in the Gulf, we may see a lot more mudslides occurring in this particular area. So this is going to be a high risk area that we really need to keep our eyes on.
Yeah.
Melanie,
I hadn't thought of the impact of mudslides. Go ahead.
I was just going to build off of what Melanie was talking about with, the movement of these wrecks. And that is, an indirect impact is going to be that potentially polluting wrecks. A number of these World War I and World War II vessels that were sunk, particularly that were targeted by U-boats, were supply ships carrying oil, bunker oil, crude oil, and things like that. And we do know that, some of these are percolating oil out of the hulls, but any significant impact to the hull, any breaches, any damage related to some of these increased storm events or dislocation due to mudslide instabilities could result in a sudden release. We have a good handle on the threats presented by these ships.
Right.
Amanda, I think that's such an excellent point. I know that within our sanctuary system, we have a number of sites of concern, and that's because they either have known cargoes that are contaminants or potentially hazardous, and that's not only hazardous to the marine organisms on site, but hazardous to the humans who interact with these sites. And a lot of materials are now reaching the end of their lifespan. Those containers that were purposely fully used to contain these resources. And one of the expectations is that as all of these direct impacts to heritage resources continue and are exacerbated by climate change impacts, the degradation and corrosion of materials and storage containers, that we're going to see a release of those contaminants. And that is something that we're trying to track at NOAA, but it's frankly something that we don't have a good handle on. Very few records were kept as to where these hazardous materials were dumped, and we don't have a lot of information about the integrity, the structural integrity of those containers at present.
Right. I know there is a NOAA study on potentially polluting wrecks in federal waters, and that also, Matt Carter has been focusing on this, the Major Projects Foundation, on studying this in the Pacific. Just a cast back to the shallow water wrecks of Thunder Bay. But those are some of the many direct and indirect impacts, and there are more, of course, that affect this broad range of heritage resources in a broad range of environments. And but to move on, the question is, knowing some of this, how are we integrating our response to the study of UCH and maritime heritage within a federal management or agency management network? And this is difficult. And I will start by saying that, there's guidance emerging at the international, national, and regional levels from many programs and agencies, but I think from what I've seen, it tends to take a very high level approach and discuss cultural heritage, and at times bring up archaeology as a resource that's being impacted, but doesn't necessarily call out UCH or maritime or the marine environment often. And so in our own agency in NOAA, we have been developing some internal guidance, some best practices, and resource gap analysis, data gap analysis that we use internally, and we want to work into our response as an agency, into our plannings for climate impact. But Maddie, maybe you can talk about the plan to include this in monitoring.
Sure. So right now within the National Marine Sanctuary System, within our Maritime Heritage Program, it's really a four-step approach to integrating climate change into our management. Our first step is to educate ourselves, as well as additional agency personnel and potential funders, resources that would allow us to do some of this research. And it's really educating all of these different groups and individuals on both underwater cultural heritage, its value, its treatment within the National Marine Sanctuary System, and the impacts of climate change to those resources. The next step that we're working on currently is to influence grant funding opportunities. So NOAA has a number of different funding opportunities that are put out annually or semi-annually that have very specific calls for research, and we're trying to influence some of those opportunities to be able to draw in partners and to present researchers with the opportunity for federal funds to study these resources and these impacts. We're also trying to reevaluate our inventory and monitoring of our heritage resources, and that's both tangible and intangible, and trying to think about what we know about these resources, their current state of preservation, their degradation, their threats and disturbances, and then to think about how climate change is going to impact that inventory and monitoring, and to add in specific attributes that we can be studying to think about climate change impacts. And finally, we're trying to conduct research that is climate change specific. So trying to look at very focused studies that emphasize very specific aspects. And I know that Stephanie Gandula has a little bit more to say about that.
Thank you, Maddie. Yes, for sure. Those 4 points here in Thunder Bay, we are very excited about deploying them on the ground, on the water, if you will. And from communication and education about the climate change issue as a whole, not just how it affects our heritage. But then also the two things I would like to mention here is the monitoring and the research. So taking a positive spin on it, it is a good impetus to up our game and be more and more systematic about how we document and monitor and more regularly monitor our shipwreck sites, which is a big challenge for us here in Thunder Bay. Freshwater, but we do have dozens and dozens of shipwreck sites to monitor. And so not only an opportunity to up our game with how we monitor and how often and the details we collect, but also to engage stakeholders and citizen scientists to help with that. And then as far as the research side of things, very recently our site was awarded a project to partner with another NOAA agency, the acidification program, to really undertake one of the first baseline studies of lake acidification right here in the 4,300 square miles of Thunder Bay. So it's nice to see those goals that Maddie enumerated there actually at play in a pretty quick turnaround.
Right. If we can open it up to the rest of the panel, that's a very federally focused, U.S. focused plan on what we're doing. Of course, it's kind of NOAA focused a bit, but that makes sense given who some of us are. But more broadly to the whole panel, if we're going to produce guidance, are we at the stage where we know what we know, or are we realizing how much we don't know? And so that's why our data gap analysis is important. But what else do we need to know, and who is being left out of the planning if we're going to discuss cultural resources, the marine environment, even intangible heritage, knowledge, and practices? What's being left out? Question for the panel broadly.
I'll jump in. We tend to think of, as scientists, a lot of us consider ourselves to be the shepherds of this information. We collect the information, we put together the tools and the methods, and then we share that back out. And quite often there's an implicit sort of quid pro quo, understanding that, you tell us where these important things are, and we will tell you how to protect them. And in some cases, that is antagonistic towards communities, especially communities that have been marginalized and don't have the same sort of power structures that we do. Their sacred spaces are not to be shared with outsiders. And so finding ways to communicate and share information about climate change, about those assessments, those impacts, and things that can be done to protect or record information before they're lost to climate change, need to be shared in a way that there's not the expectation that all information has to be given to us, that we can put that information out for communities to use.
Good point. Others?
One of the points we were making was, sometimes that information is given to us and it's not given adequate credence. Listening to the oral traditions of indigenous groups, there are numerous examples. There are a lot of really good websites put together by, at least in Canada, there's a group of several First Nations websites, and they cite all of these, and every now and then something comes out like the DNA proves that what the Inuit were saying was true, and everyone seems amazed. And then 5 years later, another story comes out and everyone seems amazed. It's like, and yet in some areas, oral tradition is allowed as evidence in court, and it needs to be more widespread. So paying attention to and giving credence to oral tradition, and not, as Amanda said, not everything will be shared. It can't be. They're owned and they're not allowed to share. But when it is, and then we don't listen to it, everyone loses. And it's not just North America. I mean, the Sami peoples of Scandinavia said that European historians ignored Norse sagas because they thought they were all mythology, and they're full of history. So it's not a new problem, but maybe we need to address it differently and pay more attention to it consistently. And the other thing I've mentioned is that a little while ago, relatively recently, the National Park Service, if you get out of the water for a moment, did a survey and said about 78% of their visitors are basically white, European descent. And yet the U.S. Census Bureau has predicted by 2045 in the U.S., it will not be a white nation because of it's such a melting pot. And they said, if you're not reaching out to people now who don't normally feel comfortable, whether it's racial or ethnicity or LGBTQ, or there's a group of people who are consider themselves plus sized and not your traditional outdoors people. And they wrote an article saying, we don't feel comfortable coming outside with all the people with the right gear. And, all these groups, they're going to be running the show by 2045. And if they don't care, if they don't have an interest, if they don't feel engaged, how are we going to get support from them to maintain our sanctuaries, our parks? And as I said, this was being steered toward national park system. And while we can make some arguments that people do recognize the value of the ocean for fishing, for livelihood, to get them to pay attention to cultural aspects and the integration of culture and economy and fisheries and science in general, we're going to have to engage them now and give them a viable role.
Mm-hmm. I think you're right, and that the climate impacts simply exacerbate and bring to the fore issues like that of inclusion of value and funding and support for parks, sanctuaries, and ultimately UCH.
Hans, I wanted to point out too that one of the first bullet points we have on this slide is technical data gaps, and given that we are in the decade of ocean science, I think it's really important for us to remember that as archaeologists, we have a very good and important role to play in this conversation, but we need to also be reaching out to our colleagues in other sciences, because this is not an issue that we can solve alone. We need a lot of other input. And rather than try to be the ultimate experts on everything associated with this topic, we need to be partnering with others.
Right. We've got to wear many hats. We're multidisciplinary. It might have been nice once to imagine that all we would have to do is be interested in maritime history and look at shipwrecks and nothing else, but I'm afraid those days are gone. And so we're challenged with a much more interesting and broad mandate to understand these resources.
I'd like to jump on that and offer the federal standpoint if I can, just to kind of not to beat a dead horse, but sometimes these data gaps don't quite become evident until we as resource management agencies are forced to take on a new responsibility, one that we hadn't considered before. For example, BOEM is now responsible for overseeing carbon capture and sequestration in offshore waters. This is a very new responsibility, and we are just in the process of trying to figure out what we don't know. So for example, the Gulf of Mexico is being targeted for potential carbon storage in depleted oil and gas reservoirs, far offshore. And we don't know what those environmental impacts are going to look like yet. I mean, we've been doing this on land since the 1970s, but in the offshore environment, we haven't been. This is going to be a new frontier for us. So it's going to be difficult to try and sort out what are the different environmental impacts that we need to be looking at and including in our decision-making process for the permitting part of this. And we have no idea what those impacts are going to look like for underwater cultural heritage. So maybe some of the questions we need to be looking at are going to come more from ocean acidification type studies and looking at changes in water chemistry and how that might affect, wood degradation, metal corrosion. But I mean, right now we don't know. So there's a huge data gap for us.
That's a good point. And just like with restoration efforts, the response to climate impacts could have its own set of impacts that we're not clear about yet. Right.
Hans, if I could just add one statement to that to build on what Amanda and Melanie were saying about the responsibilities. It is a pretty exciting times to use, what we talked about, Hans, we used to just study the shipwrecks and focus on just the maritime heritage and those rich stories. But now we have the responsibility and opportunity to use those stories to not only engage the other scientists studying the ecosystem as a whole, but also the public to hopefully care more and inspire action for climate change, even outside of the focus on our maritime heritage.
Right. Well, and plus the fact that some of these sites, especially, nearshore archaeological sites, habitation sites, have the information themselves of past climatic regimes that we need to understand in order to respond to this current crisis. And so, loss of integrity and information at those sites is a loss of our ability to respond, and that's kind of in line with one of the ICOMOS main tenets, that cultural heritage is a climate asset, that the knowledge that's contained within the heritage is what we need to address the current situation. Very interesting. But let's move on to something that we've all been scratching our head about, because we realize that multiple programs and agencies are beginning to take on a more specific approach to UCH, the marine environment, from the perspective of climate impacts. But how do we coordinate and share this knowledge? What is out there to help us kind of standardize and agree upon and have this discussion? And I will mention one tool, which is an online tool by the Marine Protected Areas. It's the Cultural Heritage Online Toolkit, and has a number of pages. It's designed for a resource or a site manager to get a fast overview of what they need to know about cultural landscapes, maritime archaeology, and there's the climate adaptation page. So that link will be included at the end as well. But I'll open it up to the rest of the panel to address, how do we coordinate with professionals in this field?
Well, I think one of the first things that we're all trying to do is just trying to get the message out there and trying to connect individuals who are working on this research with folks who are interested in it. And I know that there's a number of studies going on around the world. This is really a global topic of interest to so many researchers. And part of it is trying to create those forums for public discourse, even today's presentation, and trying to connect practitioners with people who are interested. And I think part of that, and what will hopefully come out of that, is you'll get standardization of terms that are used. You're going to have a common shared vocabulary that people are actively working on developing right now. And the other part that comes out of that is trying to create research efforts that are in tandem. So coming up with a standardized database or data set of parameters that are documented at a variety of resources and a variety of environmental conditions, so that we can start building those archives of data that can be drawn upon to really understand climate impacts.
We faced this issue ourselves in just simply coordinating within our country amongst our sanctuaries office with BOEM, the National Park Service, Society for Historical Archaeology, state resource managers, and NGOs. And we realized that there isn't a single clearinghouse for information, and maybe there should be. But it means that some program or initiative has to step up to manage that clearinghouse for information and maintain it. And that's, of course, yet another task that we need to consider. Any other comments on this type of coordination from the panel?
Well, Susan, we've tried to start small, and we're trying to do a lot more partnership projects. Whenever we give out a permit or whenever we do a project, we try and include a biologist, someone who'll look at our terrain, who will look at that aspect. We're partnering with other states, other universities. There are programs that are interstate now, and we're trying to get on board with those that are those are already archaeology focused. And fortunately, the biologists, we have friendly biologists at some universities who want to integrate these. But I found myself going to meetings that, for example, we have one that is a 5-state area, and maritime had underwater cultural heritage had not been on the radar, but they had things like fisheries, the economy, pollution, security, all of the things that we actually have a foot in the door at. So I just kept showing up at their meetings and asking questions. So someone sort of said, "Who are you?" And they actually put me on their science steering committee. So it's a foot in the door. But as you said, it's very hard to do. That's 5 states. How do you keep that up? And that's me. If I retired tomorrow, my replacement might not be interested in that. So it's getting that management of that clearinghouse that's the tough part. And most agencies already, have a lot on their plate to do it. And if it goes anywhere, I bet you anything, it ends up on NOAA's doorstep. lucky you ladies, but everybody wants to help, but it is hard to get that kind of coordination. We do try and work with other countries where we can as well to try and, as Maddie said, make sure that we're all using the same terms for the same things. But I think we're at the beginning of that.
Right. Well, speaking of where we're being at the beginning of it, what are our next steps? What can we begin to do today? How can we move forward? And I think Chris and Hakan, ICUCH has also is sort of in the same position. And this is a picture of the poster that was recently completed by ICUCH on cultural heritage and climate impacts. So we're beginning to consider it, kind of following the guidance of the ICOMOS response to climate. But what can we begin to do? What are some steps that we can take? And I'll open up to the panel first, and then this is really our last question to deal with before we go into discussion with our group.
I have a pretty short answer for that, Hans, and we're very fortunate here in Thunder Bay National Marine Sanctuary that we have a large visitor center that's free and open year round, and we get almost 100,000 visitors in normal years. And so what we're doing right away and have been is using that tool to communicate positively about climate change as a whole, and also, of course, how it affects our cultural heritage. But that has been a really powerful tool to engage the people that come here and to engage sanctuary audiences, for sure.
Mm-hmm.
And I can come at this from the research standpoint in terms of UCH. I think we need to expand just beyond studying UCH from an archaeology lens and try and devote a lot more of our attention and time towards developing these multidisciplinary, multi-stakeholder partnerships to look at not just UCH, but UCH within a broader ocean conservancy sense and climate heritage and all of that. And I think as we build these relationships with other scientists, science with a big S, I think we can help develop that appreciation in some of the other scientific disciplines as to how much UCH can provide information. And I mean, just to give you a bumper sticker, slogan for the rest of the day is, never underestimate the power of a bunch of passionate nerds. I mean, if we can get a bunch of biologists and physical scientists and geologists excited about UCH because they're studying them with us, that can percolate across the scientific community in general, and they can help elevate our voices amongst, science in general, that UCH needs to be considered as well as, sperm whales and coral reefs and fish and all of that. So I think that's an untapped resource for us, is scientists from other disciplines.
Right. Good point. And personally, I'm so glad that it ultimately became cool to be a nerd, because I struggled in high school. So I just want to throw that in there. But this is a pretty broad question. This question 6, what can we do? And it's really a topic for a larger discussion with the group. So that's the bulk of our presentation. I do want to point out in a couple of reference slides, though, that we want to simply put these in as reference for the archived YouTube video. There have been a number of recent workshops that have been hosted online, of course. Unfortunately, the one at SHA recently was canceled, but the international level, there have been some very interesting workshops, the one in December by the IPCC. And there have been recent publications as well. The Status of Tribes and Climate Change report, the ICOMOS Zero draft, and the white paper that Martijn Manders circulated recently. And then there are pending publications. David Gregory and others is coming out with Of Time and Tide, which really takes a look at the technical data and the gaps in our knowledge, as does Maddie Roth's Climate Change Impacts. And there will be sessions at pending conferences. Society for Historical Archaeology in January 2023 will have a session that we're working on defining, and the next Asia Pacific conference in 2023. I think we're going to have a session there, or perhaps even the theme, but that's still under planning. And then, like I mentioned, and I'm sorry I wasn't able to put them into the chats column since I was presenting the PowerPoint, but I hope some were put in there. We have referred to some of the documents that back up the topics discussed under these 6 questions. And so I wanted to include 2 summary slides that have those titles and links to those documents. And I know it might be a bit small, but I hope it comes out in terms of resolution on the YouTube for viewers who want to find that information and link to it and download those documents. And there are a number of really interesting pieces, like the impacts of hurricane activity in the Gulf, climate change action plans from the Park Service, and others. So that is this slide number 1, showing you the links to those documents that we used and gathered when we were putting together the structure for these loosely based 6 questions, and reference slide number 2 for the other references as well. There are things we didn't get around to mentioning, of course, and you might notice them here. There's a Marine Protected Areas Rapid Vulnerability Assessment tool, which can be easily adapted to understanding the UCH impacts from climate change, etc. So I just wanted to put that slide up, not go over each and every one of them, but it's there for reference in the future. So that is the presentation. I know it's a lot of information, and it was hard to wrangle all the topics together, but I think that the question format did it for us in the best manner possible at this stage. There's a lot we still don't know. And at this point, we would like to discuss and listen to your questions and suggestions, and perhaps there are other conferences, other documents that we need to know about. So thank you. I'll thank my panel, and I'll stop sharing my screen and hand it back over to Hakan and Chris.
Hakan, are you there? Would you like to say a few words before I ask a couple of questions? Hakan? No?
Yeah, actually, amazing presentations, amazing panel, and I really want to thank to all of us, and it is very perfectly new, for me, unknown studies in the United States, and I appreciate, thank you very much. And the second thing I would like to show it in my hand is our new book. Finally, I can put it in my hands, and now we are going to send this book to all the ICOMOS members, and at least 5 copies, Hans, please, or 6 copies to you, to all the panelists from this presentation. Thank you very much again.
That's much appreciated, but now you just told them what they're all getting for Christmas, so you know, no surprise.
Thank you, Hakan. I only wish to reiterate what Hakan said, but also just to say in very broad terms, I was fortunate enough to be involved in the co-sponsored meetings before December, and many of the themes and topics that had been described in this panel hit the nail on the head. All of those things, I think all of those things came up in the broader context of cultural heritage without being, you know, limited to underwater cultural heritage. So I think listening to the presentation, we're all on, certainly this presentation is on the right page. Those are the big questions, and about communication, but perhaps the biggest is the integration or the gaps analysis between what we might describe as established Western science, other sciences, and indigenous science, and local community input. That was probably the most discussed across the entire week. And trying to find some form of mutual respect and reciprocity, I think, was a goal that was set. Coming out of those meetings, what ICOMOS has done and is doing is to focus on individual aspects of the conversation and beginning to develop toolkits. And I wondered whether, with the panelists' experience here, that the US perhaps, or even it could be internationally based if you wish, could develop a toolkit which basically is like a kickstart of information. What's the problem? How do you solve, you know, why does it matter? How are you going to solve it? And where are the tools that you need to solve it? And those can be all the links that you had. So it becomes like the top of the pyramid of the knowledge that you require to effectively remediate this particular challenge we all face, which is enormous and so broad-based, it's almost impossible to categorize it within the context of a sort of panel like this. But it kicks it off, gets people thinking about certain things. And the first Kickstart toolkit that ICOMOS has initiated is climate justice and equity. And of course, for some of us, perhaps that wasn't such an obvious topic. But when you begin to think about it, it becomes such a deep and resonant topic, not just within cultural heritage terrestrially, but for ourselves as well, that we must start to take into account. And that will simply be a 2 to 3 page document, and that will be the kickstart for more things to follow. And maybe something like that could be developed nationally, internationally, etc., and certainly something that ICUCH can look at. Okay, back to Hans.
I like that idea. Maybe that's a topic for, you know, these coming sessions, conferences, workshops, what have you. That, you know, maybe we do know enough at this point where we can put something like that together. Certainly, there will always be gaps in our technical knowledge. That's the nature of living on an ocean planet. But you know, if we do know enough to begin to say these are the steps to address this subset of resource, you know, at least we can say that. I don't think we're ever going to be able to answer all the questions or solve all the problems, but define our field amidst the broader cultural heritage response in the arena of climate impacts, and come up with, you know, a short, useful tool like that, and do that in a manner that has multiple eyes on it, and regionally, nationally, internationally, even. That'll take some coordination.
I think just to come back on Hans, I think in a sense, if you develop that sort of strategy, you've got outputs to all of these fabulous panels, in the sense that you've got a deliverable, you've got something to share and take away with, not just our book. And so that's something that we can all think about. And I think within ICOMOS, we're certainly thinking about that. And we also admit that what will come out as the Kickstart document will evolve inevitably. And I think that reflects what Hans has just said about we haven't got the magic bullet, let's say. We have to evolve our knowledge and evolve our paperwork. So this will be an evolutionary process, not a one-off process. Thanks, Hans. If nobody else has got questions, I've got other suggestions and statements that may be of interest to the panel. Is that yesterday I had a meeting with other ISCs, International Scientific Committee members in ICOMOS, and the focus of that was developing a methodology of pollutant shipwrecks related to, and that's, as much as I know so far, it's just the kernel of an idea that clearly is topical. Matt Carter's example came up. The Tirpitz in Norway came up as being, and they don't necessarily have to be military wrecks, they could be anything. And there's obviously huge international, national and regional scope for this. And I would like to reach out, perhaps through Hans as our rep on ICUCH, and keep everybody let's say, informed about what we're doing, so we're not necessarily, we can maximize effort rather than duplicate effort.
Yeah, I'd be happy to help with that. You know, we have a kind of an informal working group on this topic from different agencies, different programs, but maybe we need to be a little bit more formal. I don't know. How formal do we need to be in terms of organizing response? Everyone has multiple tasks and you know, is busy with lots of things, but it does take some commitment to some planning time to maintain or start some momentum and maintain some of this momentum at conferences and workshops to try to move this forward. Otherwise, it will be kind of the thing of, you know, that's the paper we gave back then, and, you know, whatever happened to that. But the climate impacts are not going to go away. So I think we'll continue with it. Others, panelists or group as a whole, any comment?
Hans, I know we talked about this in putting the panel together, but there can be a tendency to talk about climate change in a very fatalistic view. And I think when we talk, especially with other stakeholders and with the public, having actions, known actions in our back pocket that we can offer as opportunities to different audiences, whether that's handbooks, online tools, or volunteer groups. For example, the Florida Public Archaeology Network has the Heritage Monitoring Scouts, who are citizens who volunteer to go out after storms and look at different environments and sites and to see if they were impacted. But being able to offer some actions to people who are interested can really help to go a long way and to make this a more manageable topic and one that doesn't feel quite so overwhelming.
Good point. Good point. I really appreciate that about the international response too. That heritage is a climate asset. That what we know, and even these things that we have, these sites, can be seen in that light, more of a positive light. That this gives us an opportunity to take a fresh look at the resource and see what it has to tell us about what we need to know about climate regime, climate change.
And just to add to that, I think it's really important, and I've shared this with, or Amanda shared this with us at a recent meeting, is the importance of looking at the intangible impact on intangible heritage, and the social consequences of loss, risk, and the mitigation of climate change. And all of those things have come up in these the co-sponsored meetings. But I think you've got to start somewhere with some sort of statement of how to do it and how to start the process, because it's enormous and it covers every aspect of social life as well. And I think it's impossible to think about it in one, let's say, session. There's got to be multiple sessions, but not necessarily, they can be parallel, but not the same. So it's developing a process, I think, and we're all at the beginning of that process.
I just want to sort of add in maybe an additional thought, in that we know that resources are going to be lost, and that's at the far end of the spectrum, and that we're at our present point. But what we're going to find, I think, along the way, and something that comes up a lot, is we're going to have remarkable opportunities to build real, meaningful relationships with constituencies, because we know that once resources are perceived as being lost, they become valuable. And so we're going to have these incredible opportunities to build relationships, to reconceptualize how we manage resources, and whether it's the tangible physical site we're protecting, or the data within, or if it's the relationship that living communities have to that resource. And this, I think, just opens up so many opportunities, both for heritage protection and preservation, for management, and thinking about resources and how they connect to living communities, how communities perceive their maritime environments. And I think that's part of why we're all archaeologists, is we want to look at those relationships that have occurred in the past and continue to the present and will continue into the future.
Agreed.
Yeah, I think I like Amanda's idea that that giving people something positive. I think that's part of it. Is everybody feels a despair, they feel helpless, and give them something that they can actually do with their hands now. That will, even if the resource is ultimately lost, whether it's recording it or collecting stories before we lose our living resources through age, or photos or whatever. But it makes people feel, as Maddie was just saying, not only are they part of it, they're part of the cure, they're involved, but they have something they can physically do to feel less helpless in the situation. So I think that outreach is really critical. So I love the idea that doing this toolkit and doing a lot more than handing out posters and brochures, which is a lot of what we do in talking, but taking people out for heritage monitoring scouts. We're trying that here. We're also doing the rec tagging with the QR codes, so that when timbers go sailing down, the next person can scan it and report it, and people feel participatory. And that's, as I say, down the road, it's going to be important to have those people, whether they're kids that are going to be voting or whether they want to know where their tax dollars are going. We'd like to see them going into the sanctuaries and cultural heritage as well. So sign me up for whatever workshops, we'll do it.
We're going to hold you to that, Susan.
my probably my last intervention. Could I just say, or ask, are you intending to do this sort of panel in your next year's ACUA or the SHA meeting?
I think this gives us a leg up on discussing the session, and we can continue to refine the material, the approach, the discussion to make it productive. But this really did force us to pull something together. Much appreciated. Fairly difficult, very challenging topic, but
Exactly.
I think so. I would like to encourage the working group to begin to look at the SHA coming and perhaps the Asia Pacific Conference as well, and what we can get out of those and how we can move it forward.
I think it'd be very worthwhile, Hans, I must admit. Very.
Are we over time, Chris? Are we
must be. We must be. Normally, I get a boot from Hakan, but he must be listening with a lot of interest. We must be more or less out of time. Hakan, have you got some closing remarks?
Actually, as I said, it was really very interesting and a very nice panel, and thank you very much, Hans. Thanks a lot to all our distinguished speakers, and we all wait you to our next UNESCO and ICOMOS meeting in May 21 to 24. If you will be able to come, we will be able to host you as our guest. And thank you very much again, and have a good day. Thank you.
Thank you, Hakan, and thank you for organising the webinar as well. That's no mean task these days, and all went seamlessly. And thanks for Hans for putting together a super panel exposing so many questions, and some answers and solutions are the key to this. And engaging with the public is absolutely crucial.
It was a panel effort. And Chris, can I ask you, could you copy the chat column for me just to make sure we record those remarks as well before you close completely?
Yeah, I think I've already saved the chat, but let me go again.
Okay, good. Thank you. Yeah, it really is the panel that pulled this together, and it's a mutual effort over here.
Yeah, bear with me a second. Okay, chat saved, Hans.
Thank you.
Okay. Well, thanks everybody. I wish you everybody the rest of the day is super, and wherever you are, it's either not snowing because you don't want it to snow, or it is snowing because you want it to snow. I thought that was great. That only in the US, isn't it? Brilliant.
May I say something? As you know, all the panel is already recorded, and if there is any objection, we will put this recording to our YouTube channel. Okay, thank you.
Thanks, Hakan, for reminding us. Thank you, everybody. I think we can leave. Thanks very much for your time, and thanks for the people that listened. Time for tea.